Welcome everybody to YouTube Masterclass, Coursera, Harvard, USC, Calarts, Dr. Aaron Sheley. We're here in class 3 of film studies, auteur studies on Quentin Tarantino. Now, the auteur is a confusing word because it's actually a French word that originated with Francois Truffaut when he was writing the La Politique des Auteurs. And it's an article that came it was before the philosophy of 68. It was actually 59, 58, 55 even. The Politique of Auteurs was somewhere being rewritten between 55 and 58 for the Cahiers du Cinéma, which was in France, in Paris. And they had this philosophy in the film school, or the Sorbonne, or the sort of film studies at the Cinematheque, led by André Bazin and Henry Langlois, who was an archivist and a film historian that took care of all the movies. There was an influx of American films, and then these French New Wave films kind of took from the American films and kind of chop-choppied them up into their own way, and their editing machinery is so complex in the New Wave, with these jump cuts and these time frames and these faders and these freeze frames and all these kind of in-camera and later editing on the editing table tricks. So let's just say that Quentin Tarantino was really influenced by Jean-Luc Godard, and we've already talked enough about that, but they're both auteurs, and Tarantino's a postmodern auteur. He takes all the sort of montages and homages that are out in cinema, especially Hollywood classical cinema, and he preserves it in this kind of way by recontextualizing. Now, recontextualizing is like reappropriation. You take the imagery and sound and you transplant it somewhere else in your world of the film. And the world of the film of Quentin Tarantino's second film is Pulp Fiction. Now, the art of Pulp Fiction is that it's this rebel without a cause kind of train wreck, which Rebel Without a Cause is already like a train wreck. And it does take place in only like 4 to 5 days of time between each other. It took a lot longer to film. It was like 3 years, 4 years. They were filming it while they were filming Reservoir Dogs, for one thing. Before they wrapped on Reservoir Dogs, Quentin Tarantino and his cast and crew, they were already filming for scenes of Pulp Fiction. And it wasn't just so they could economically regain their money, because these guys aren't sellouts. They're absolutely not working just for just so they can have a big pile of cash. I'm sure they do have a big pile of cash. So, but if they don't have to feel bad, because they're not sellouts. They're not like, we're making all of this just, and nobody really in Hollywood can be a sellout, because they have to have their own vision. And these people with auteurs, the directors, they have to bring their own imagery to the world of the film, whether it comes from script or book, and Pulp Fiction's in a script. And the script, even though Roger Avery was a co-writer, the script by Tarantino and Avery, and then ultimately the ultimate script of it by Tarantino that was released, which was pretty much the same, and I'm pretty sure Roger Avery wanted credit, but I don't want to get into that, because that's like personal details about the film we don't really need to explore. Because although there is an Oscars where Roger Avery stood up and picked up a statue and was talking about how Quentin Tarantino and him had written this really big screenplay. So they're making movies after Reservoir Dogs. They're thinking it's part of Reservoir Dogs. It becomes its own movie. Some of the cast is the same. Now, I've got the cast of Pulp Fiction called up. It's John Travolta, Uma Thurman, Samuel L. Jackson, Bruce Willis, Tim Roth, and Amanda Plummer. There's a lot more too if I hit this button here. But anyway, that's our main cast we're dealing with. Now, that doesn't count for Eric Stoltz and Steve Buscemi and all the other massive, and Ving Rhames, and the massive cast of this movie. Now, one thing about the independent film movement of the 90s is everybody was being really original, and talk about not selling out. They were privileging the movie for the sake of movie. And this is a postmodern notion that fits well. Because the idea for us to go wildly forward on making a project that's so daring, so original, and will blow your mind when you see it, because it's like this Rubik's Cube of time delivered to you in 3 days, but it's all mashed up so that like they play in this sort of Citizen Kane way, except his world in Citizen Kane changes throughout the world of the film. His age, especially, you'll notice in particularly, because in one scene he'll be a little kid, in the next one he'll be an old man, in the next one he'll be like, 33, and then he's 54 again. But in Pulp Fiction, it's like this documentary that's all told out of sequence, Citizen Kane. And then, you have a movie like Weekend by Godard, and it actually is told in sequence, strangely enough, or at least from the moments that happen. But it seems out of sequence, but it's not. But there are Godard movies that are, like Band Apart, the company that Tarantino and Rodriguez formed, who was one of the producers, along with like Jane Hampshire and everybody else, and Lawrence Bender. But the context of the film switches its imagery and modular diaphragm, we should say, from scene to scene, and you're like, this is out of sequence, or it's parts of the story overlap, but it plays like Band Apart or Band of Outsiders, where the film is actually, the first part happens, then the last part happens, then the middle part happens. And you kind of see that in Pulp Fiction, but really, there was a time in high school that I tried to edit Pulp Fiction back into sequence. And as I took the tape and I was like, I wonder what it's like edited in sequence. And it's real hard to do. I don't even think, I got like halfway through and I was like, that's too hard. That's going to take another 7 months. And then my friend, again, Matt McAllister, was like, I've done it and it's really hard to do. And, and so we watched it. We watched his version. And it's cool. It's a cool movie, but nothing's as good as the release itself. Version or no version changing, those are usually minute things that change, but sometimes they're bigger ones that they're doing a special edition for. I'm not trying to scare you with the idea that you're never going to see the definitive version of Pulp Fiction, because, I'm never going to see it again, because, get this, everybody, both my copies of Pulp Fiction got stolen, but I'm going to get them back somehow. I'm not taking any revenge over that, but it's a heist in and of itself around here. Pulp Fiction does get stolen a lot in these circumstances. I don't know. I've had that one stolen quite a bit, so I'm not complaining. I'm not registering a complaint but anyway, we were going to look at this menu, and this menu is Jackrabbit Slims, and it comes out of the Pulp Fiction disc. Now, I found this because I had it on the wall, and it has these menu items, and it looks like a real menu, this Jackrabbit Slims menu, and it's beautiful because it comes with the Pulp Fiction release on the version I love most. And we have complete dinners, and there's stuff on here like chicken fried salad, chicken fried steak, and this looks really good, but it's all these funny names on it. And it's cool because the publicity of Pulp Fiction to include a menu of Jackrabbit Slims, which is the one where John Travolta and Uma Thurman, early in the film, kind of later in the film, about an hour and a half in, they drive up to Jackrabbit Slims, and it's this huge set of this 1950s sort of American Graffiti set. And then it's a total shot from American Graffiti when they pull up and they're dressed like that. And she's like drawing a square in the sky. Really sets off why the film is colored like a James Dean movie. East of Eden, giant. And you sort of you go right in with this tracking shot, and it follows you in this really long tracking shots. Now, we all know Martin Scorsese and Stanley Kubrick do really long tracking shots. Kubrick's are like down a corridor, and Martin Scorsese is like kind of side to side, like a long tracking shot. Like you can track side to side, forward to forward. But in both Kubrick and Scorsese, you can have this reveal as it goes. And that's what you're getting from this Tarantino shot, is a reveal as it goes. Now, deep focus, long take is kind of this idea that like you're inheriting reality. So for this to be a fantasy of the movie, although there are 50s themed restaurants, just shows that the movie is illustrating fantasy in the middle of this kind of like realistic, urbane. These guys are still suit and tie mobsters dressed like, Reservoir Dogs. It's like they know some of the characters from Reservoir Dogs. Like one of the characters, Vincent Vega, is like brothers with the Vega brothers. His other brother is a character from Reservoir Dogs. So now we have this total conjunction between the two movies because the worlds enter each other right away. And this isn't recontextuality. This is intertextuality, where you take either a clip from something else or your own and you put it back into your own movie in terms of a character, in terms of a character's relationship to a character. Even a setting where they were might have changed. One thing about the filming of Pulp Fiction that's strange is Quentin Tarantino was going around studio to studio, pretty much buying out studio space and filming all these big scenes. Like it was almost carte blanche if it wasn't. And by that I mean the studios, Miramax at the time gave him money, or they didn't really give him money. Pretty much it was all his money. I mean, when you're a filmmaker, you're pretty much investing your own money and then running it through the studio for pay, and then they pay, the people involved, and you kind of have to keep buying in. But if you get a big box office, you're okay, etc. Reservoir Dogs had such a massive box office that can't even be traced. It's like it's still going on, and on home video, it's still a huge thing. And so now we're at the tracking shot with, Jackrabbit Slims, and you're following it through, and you see the characters at the table, and John Travolta's taking Ving Rhames' character, Marcellus Wallace's wife, Mia Wallace, out to Jackrabbit Slims because he needs someone to watch his wife. But earlier we had seen that the two gangsters, Travolta and Jackson, after the scene in the diner with the credits, are walking down this hall, and they come up to the store and they kind of stand in front of it. You can tell right away when they're in the car talking about cheeseburgers and everything at the beginning, and the Le Royale with cheese, why they don't have a quarter pounder, because it's not the metric system. Look at the big brains on Brad. And then there's this whole thing about how they're mobsters, and they're hard-hitting mobsters, and they're really bad. They'll say an N-word, they'll say a cuss word. John Travolta, I've noticed in the film, doesn't really use the N-word. Whether he opted out of that or not, I'm not going to get into that. Because I don't know. I've read the original script, and I'm not really sure if there were scenes they improvised. There were scenes they improvised. Like, for instance, with the camcorder that's in the director's cut, where she's asking him about Elvis and the Beatles in the camera. And that's right before they go to Jackrabbit Slims and Uma Thurman filming John Travolta with a camera, and it's actually recording, and she's asking him whether he likes the Beatles or Elvis, and he tells her Elvis, and Quentin Tarantino loves Elvis more, and these are all facts you need to know, but that's kind of like recontextualization, because it's like this whole My Life to Live, or like 8.5 recording. It's like this 8.5 recording of the conversation where you got the reel to reel. And she's like, the soundtrack is the most perfect soundtrack. I mean, if you're looking for the best soundtrack ever, you don't have to go far from pretty much any Tarantino movie, especially Pulp Fiction. And we all know that's true, but we all forget. We're writing down American Graffiti is our favorite soundtrack, which probably is. But the Pulp Fiction soundtrack, I had forgotten for a while. It's like I'm so used to it that I'm like, I'm taking it for granted. It's the greatest soundtrack. And the Preacher Man song, and the Miserlou at the beginning, all these songs throughout that are recontextualized, like, smoking cigarettes and watching Captain Kangaroo. When Bruce Willis is driving to get his watch, there's a lot more scenes of that in the original edit that was in theatrical films. But again, I'm not saying the ultimate, most amazing version is not the one in the DVD box. That's why it's good to buy the DVD, even if you've seen the movie in theaters. So there is one distinction. The theatrical version is a little bit different, not just because of color timing and the width of the screen and our width of our screen on a TV, where you watch DVD unless you're watching it on a projector. But the TV and the theater do play differently, even if it's the same version. And the timing on the film moves like seconds away or seconds before, not just because they had to resplice it for the theatrical version, which is all done digital projector now, or the DVD at home, which is kind of this enhanced but made for your lesser big TV. I mean, isn't that the whole idea of cinema? Is like this Jackrabbit Slim's idea that like we come in with this giant camera and we see things that are huge, and we draw a cartoon square in the sky for Uma Thurman, and then we go in and it's like, I mean, he's right out of Saturday Night Fever, John Travolta. And he's coming, and they go and they sit down, and of course now he's having a burger. They've already discussed earlier in the film that Samuel L. Jackson had stolen a burger after he shot a guy, and he's playing Itty Bitty Mighty Mo, and there's this whole scene in this apartment in L.A., and this whole thing's this L.A. tapestry, and the L.A. tapestry is like Elmore Leonard. That's what they were kind of going for in Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction. But there's a scene where they show this bar in between a lot of the stories, and the stories will all be demarcated with letters like a Godard movie, like even Band Apart. Like the Gold Watch is a sequence. The Gold Watch would probably come last in the film if it was put back into sequence. The things at the beginning would go towards the beginning, but the first thing you have is them actually, there's the Bonnie situation, and that's the third part originally in the movie, but I think it comes before the Bruce Willis section, and then there's bits and pieces all throughout that go in different places, but the first one is Marcellus Wallace's wife, Mia Wallace, is the first story, and that's what they type in the typography. And it's hard to say that what goes where is interesting, because there's a lot of times that they'll jump narrative to elaborate on the story they're on. That's what Pulp Fiction, the layman's term of it, is like pulp. It shows the definition, orange, or a mass of a substance that produces all kinds of hodgepodge of information and details about something, or something that's a mass of pulp of like an object, and paper, is pulp type of paper. Wood comes from wood. Paper comes from wood pulp, And so when you're writing a script, it's like the pulp carries you across. In the early days of novels in the 50s, I guess not early days, whatever, a long time ago in the 50s, not that long ago, they would have these Pulp Fiction books. And they were like hard-boiled detective stories, these sort of ones that would build a film noir on, like Gun Crazy or something. And the novels that are hard-boiled detective kind of have, cussing, they have violence, they have sexuality, they have these big numbers that blow up and explode, like the Pandora's box at the end of Kiss Me Deadly. And I think that the point I'm trying to make is that in these illusory images of the film, we see the context regularly stretched out. Because there's no way you can really sit and hear a story like that in one sitting, but we do in Pulp Fiction, and we all have many times, or watched it in pieces, because it has this sort of piecemeal narrative. And I don't mean piecemeal as in like barren, I mean in puzzly. It's like we have to put this maze back together, And it's just like Citizen Kane in that way, because even though the parts I didn't have readjusted exactly, but the point is that when the sex, drugs, and rock and roll of this movie explode, you're like, this is the 90s, this is why I love the 90s, and you're sitting back there, and I'm sitting back there, I'm kind of like this nerd, just watching a movie, and I'm like thinking, that was told out of sequence, wow. And then there's so many other things about it that are important. It's production design, of elaborate attention to detail, the the editing, being told out of sequence is beautiful, but the fundamental audio and the soundtrack it has is very Godardian, because the sound will come on sometimes at an unexpected time. We've talked about with Reservoir Dogs, a contrapuntal sound in that scene of the gold watch with Bruce Willis is like a contradictory song kind of for him to be listening to in that film. And there's all kinds of other examples, like during the gold watch scene later, where Bruce Willis has to go back in to save Marcellus Wallace. To clarify, that scene is not my favorite scene to watch, because here you get that whole narrative of ideals where the cinema is so important, we forget that the ethics of the characters isn't that important. But the ethics of the characters are beyond important in Pulp Fiction, to say the least, because at the end, there's kind of this mock Bible lesson that has this, like, I will shepherd the weak, you can fail with the lesser strong kind of narrative that he's setting up. That's more of a Roadhouse parable than it is, because we know John Travolta dies later in the film, but it happens earlier in the film, you know. So for Samuel L. Jackson to be reporting on this biblical knowledge after we've seen all these lessons of darkness is this sort of Scorsese moment of, like, now we have this ending which is ironic, or Kubrick ending which is ironic, you know. And that is this whole lesson that, he keeps choosing between the guns between the characters on the table to get them all, to slow down, and they're stealing his briefcase. He gets his briefcase back, Samuel L. Jackson, and then he tells this like biblical tale, and I don't think it's really in the Bible, but it could be, because there's no two copies of the Bible the same, and Hollywood wrote the Bible, is my theory. The theory is that most Bibles change after what Hollywood says they should, and Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction is better than the Bible anyway. We all know that, right? But that's probably why I got mine stolen. I was sacrificing to it my coffee cup. No. So I had that book, Standard of Time is with us, because we still have plenty of time in class. We have about 30 minutes left. And so if you want to get a drink of water, that's fine. But you'll have to pause it to do that, And I just wanted to say, it's a good morning. Things are going good in Masterclass. It's third class. Pulp Fiction's auteur style does go into the art of cool. The art of cool being a detached, kind of smooth locus of information that was brought upon you by the registering social class that can explain the inferred acceptance of this sort of guard the weak, accept the strong, accept the less strong, but the less strong will not prevail against the strong, especially if they prevail against the weak. And I think that's a whole object lesson, really, from that narrative. I don't think it's not just funny that he's reading the Bible before he shoots people in the beginning of the film. It's also interesting that later in the film, that scene isn't as funny. It's funny when they go blow those dudes up, because they're like these, like, real decayed morons kind of sitting there. I mean, they're just gone with it, and they're getting shot up, and we're pretty sure those are the right guys, because they had the notorious briefcase of Marcellus Wallace. And then I said I was going to talk about the disenfranchisement of Marcellus Wallace. But I don't want to get too much into these kind of barriers that people have watching the film, because really this film does send a universal message. A head gets blown up in a car, and it gets cleaned up. It's like, instead of something going from regular to blown up, then it goes back to clean in this movie. They clean it back up. They move it to a different shot. Maybe why he was using so many different sets, Quentin Tarantino. And I don't know, dude. It's like, you see these, like when he has that milkshake at Jack Rabbit Slim's. Here on this menu, we've got milkshakes, right? And it's like, yeah, and he's quoting what an expensive $5 milkshake it is. And this is like contextualizing it, as Dana Poland would say, in the here and now, because most milkshakes nowadays are $5, but Jack Rabbit Slim's wasn't a real restaurant. It's probably conspiratorially like one of those Hitchhiker Guide to the Galaxy restaurants that really existed on truck stops. It might be hidden in L.A. that they buried Tarantino's Jack Rabbit Slim's. But there are restaurants like Gunther Tootie's and things like that, right? that have these 1950s themes. And they don't, then there's like Universal Studios, who has these kind of people playing James Dean and walking around looking like these characters who are in these movies. And then you get John Travolta kind of looking like Dean, and then he's got this thing going on where he's dancing like Saturday Night Fever with Uma Thurman, and the dance number is more proof that this is the Teenage Wedding plays on that, like Chuck Berry. And the thing is that they're Uma Thurman and John Travolta are dancing in this competition to win the trophy. Like she said, she demands it. She's the wife of a big mob boss, so she has a lot of pull, you would say, in the characterization of the world of her, that is, she's the all-powerful one. And then she gets minorly disenfranchised, but she's back on her feet later in the movie, and you can only tell that by, in your mind, putting the sequence back together. But Tarantino filmed it in such a way that you put the scenes back together anyway, because each one is episodic themes. Each story is episodic themes. And that just means that there's a shot that juxtaposes another shot that's metaphorical, that's in terms of what the chapter has to do with the narrative at the time. The story is flowing through the movie as the way the characters should portray it, the story of these two mobsters and how they go on different paths and how they reconvene, and how this sort of boxer and all these, and then finally these restaurant mobsters our gangsters are holding up the restaurant. And you think it's going to be this scene where everybody's there, but it's really only John Travolta and Samuel L. Jackson, because they're the characters you follow from the beginning to end. So my theory on this disenfranchisement thing is Samuel L. Jackson isn't disenfranchised in this movie. I mean, he does come pretty close in a couple of numbers. And he does maybe say some offensive things because they're gangsters. Remember, gangsters say offensive things. I'm not trying to be rude or anything when I explain that. But gangsters say really offensive things. I don't know any gangsters in real life. No, I do. But if I did, I wouldn't expect their mouth always to be clean, especially if I was in private. Now, the thing about movies is they film our privacy. But there's nothing really unethical now about Pulp Fiction. We think of it as a lack of didacticism, and then we realize, wait, the Bible study thing at the end is funny, but it's also hilarious because they're not really into it, but it totally sends a message. And though it's like the wheel of morality, or the message that sends, we are the message that sends. It doesn't matter because it really does have a point at the end, because he says something, Samuel Jackson. His line is, I am the weak and you're the tyranny of evil men. Or it could mean that I'm the shepherd. Or it could mean that this here revolver is the shepherd. I am the tyranny of evil men and you're the weak. You are the weak. And he goes on, and before that, and he's like, it's one of those things that, one of the statements that he's saying that, like, they can have his money for robbing it, not just because they had the cojones to do it, not just because he needed the briefcase back, not just because it was good in case they got into a gunfight, but also as the sort of testament to why he's going to give it away. But then you kind of hear John Travolta in the same restaurant. We know this isn't the real ending of the movie, because that's when Bruce Willis rides off in the motorbike. But here we are in the restaurant at the end of the Temporal movie. And none of them are back in sequence, right? The Matt McAllister one, I don't know but it looks right. And it doesn't change much. It's weird, but it does. It's like these tiny little differences made the whole thing stack out. The editing, man. I'm not looking in the mysteries. I'm not trying to say any of us are making better movies than Pulp Fiction. I mean, it's the movie like Wizard of Oz or Godfather or, Dune or like Umberto D. I mean, I'm looking at these movies over here that I've got stacked up, and you've got the American movie like 2001: A Space Odyssey compares to Pulp Fiction. Pulp Fiction's up there with, Birth of a Nation and Le Vampire. It's up there with all the great movies. And if you stack out the 10 great movies of all time, Pulp Fiction should be included, said Roger Ebert. It's weird how we didn't forget that, like we did for Reservoir Dogs. We didn't burn it out because you can never burn these films out. And nobody gets burnt out watching. I've gotten burnt out watching it, but that's only because it was like the third time in a row. And I'm not sitting here bragging and saying, I'm the expert on Tarantino, I'm the expert on all these films. I'm not. But I am getting research together from these sources, and I'm saying that, like, it was basically an auteur film because the director had full control. Now, sometimes an auteur can get their metaphors on somebody else's work and still be the director and be a craftsman of production values and push it forward. But, like, even Baz Luhrmann puts his own touch on a film because, like an auteur, because he takes film scenes and kind of does a flip book with them. Like he's doing like this cartoon, but it's dancing, you know. And it's only like cartoon in the way it's frenetically edited, and even then it's more like a rapid fire editing system. And with Tarantino, like I was saying, with these deep focus long takes, you're kind of getting this Umberto D imprint of reality. So if and when we see Samuel L. Jackson walking out and putting his gun in his pants, remember, John Travolta gets disenfranchised when he gets shot by Bruce Willis. Spoilers included, you know. I'm not using all their names, but I know I should be better at that for as many times as I've seen the film. But this is a sign of oldness, and plus my Pulp Fiction box is gone, so we won't complain too much about that. But, because I still have the menu. But you don't know that these long takes and these aesthetics and these episodic thematics that connect each story, but are also there to be the chapter theme. And you have this whole thing with Christopher Walken in the Gold Watch sequence where he's like, he puts this watch in his butt, he puts it up his butt, you know, it's like, it's funny, but it's not. And I think that's one of the things Tarantino was saying in his interviews about this film. He's like, well, I'm going to make it really hilarious. But, like, it's not funny at the same time. It's, like, really funny, but not, you know. And you're like, so some critics like, well, why would you do that? And he's like, because that's the way I make my film. You know, it makes sense to me because that's one of the things that slams it together. It's funny because you're writing on pulp, but that it's fiction means that it's also the jagged, all this recontextualization of all the jagged detective novels. And these gangster novels are kind of detective novels, all squeezed into this one perfect film of lights that explode and cameras that fly through the air, you know, and things that Tarantino does in that film. He makes a miracle happen with that film. And there's no way that we can take away from anything about it because it's flawless. That there are things in it that are racist, I'm deciding not to teach as much this semester. There are good resources on that with Todd Boyd. I'm not saying I'm going out of the race, class, and gender box. I'm going to be discussing that. But I'm not teaching the whole story of whether it's racist or not on Pulp Fiction, because I think there's vindication for Samuel L. Jackson in that and nobody else, and he's not disenfranchised. And that's it's a cynical and skeptical, but it's kind of optimistic. Whether he goes homeless and walks the earth, or whether, as the film shows, he goes back to work for Marcellus Wallace underground and he's not partnered up necessarily with Vince Vega, John Travolta, after the whole thing at the dance floor. And then the thing with the head getting shot comes before even that, because they're discussing going out with. So that whole sequence goes first. The first one goes third, and this third one goes second. Put it in that order and see what I'm saying. And then there's all these little clips in between that are to like tie the narrative together, and they're in sort of this like nano world, you know, this Twilight Zone. That's why they play that song in the movie. It's that Twilight anthem. And you sort of see these floating bar scenes with the boxer at the beginning and Bruce Willis, and then later you see his whole Gold Watch sequence. So it foreshadows that, and you'd have to re-edit that, or would you? Because did they meet at that time, before or after? And it seems like it's all after, but it's actually edited today to wait, so that it's not after. It might be before or after. It doesn't matter which way you put it, because it would fit either way, because it actually comes atemporality and achronological at that time, which is not in the same story as the Gold Watch with Bruce Willis earlier. So you're sitting there like, oh, okay. So now it's out of sequence, but you also have these, these moments in between. And this is the pulp that's all hammered together to take these sort of images of the French New Wave, like My Life to Live, and images of the Italian neorealism, like Umberto Adi, which is where the guy loses his dog, and it's like this wandering of this city. This old man's wandering the city, and De Sica's Umberto D. And he's wandering after his dog, and he can't find it anywhere. But then he finds his dog at the beginning of the movie, and he's walking around with him. He's not very happy because he's old and angry, kind of like me. He's old, and he's walking around. And his dog runs off again. And then he gets really sad. And he goes and lives in this kind of, just like, hostile type place. This is all in Italy. And then he gets up and he realizes he sleeps for a while and he gets yelled at. And there's this lady, and there's kind of this weird, family that doesn't exist kind of thing. Freudian kind of thing. And then he gets out of there, and then he realizes his dog is gone again. Now he's waking up, and he's like, so he's looking. And he never finds it. Now, there's a few endings to this movie, let me mind you, that set us back in how European, there's multiple. You think there's multiple versions here. You should see the European multiple version. And even for us to market to them, we send their version to them in their way, their version of them is a lot different than our version. Ours, even in the projection, changes the timing back and forth to lose some and gain some in the imagery. So, there's, and the Pulp Fiction movie had a lot of different trailers in it, like Eyes Wide Shut did, that weren't things that happened in the final film that was made. By trailer, I mean the preview that came out in 1993, 94, that was about what Pulp Fiction was going to be, and it kind of had a scene. They even showed it won the MTV Movie Awards when it came out. I thought that was the best award it won, because I was like, finally, the best movie of all time wins an MTV award, And it's like everybody in the future is going to look back and say, that movie is the one that won, was the movie that really won an amazing MTV award. But then Joe's Apartment won, And I'm like, well, Joe's Apartment's a cool movie, but nothing like The Wizard of Oz that is Pulp Fiction. So I'm kind of, in a way, not really even mad that I could have the right to be. I wouldn't be, but that it seems as though Tarantino was jumping soundstage to soundstage, because that actually made it look like really cool. And the fact that it's all these big sound stages of LA is already beautiful, and that seems to mean that Miramax and Disney and all this gave Tarantino and Rodriguez and Bender all this, because they were in band apart, gave them all this. Robert Rodriguez, and we'll talk about him in a minute. Not very much, though. I'll just go through it real quick. Robert Rodriguez, Mexican director, started with El Mariachi, came on with Tarantino at Dusk Till Dawn, but they knew each other before. They both had El Mariachi and Reservoir Dogs in common, because they both helped produce each other's film and release it on video, and they did release each other's video. That they're friends, I don't know. That they collaborated on Grindhouse, yes. That they seem to get along, because they always come back editing and producing each other. That Robert Rodriguez did Mariachi all the way to Machete Returns or Machete Kills. And there's all these movies in between, Spy Kids, Sin City. And I'm curbing my enthusiasm here only because it's a really beautiful thing that Grindhouse comes along. But Grindhouse is a little further down in this class history. So we're going to go with the proposed meaning of the imagery in Pulp Fiction. That it has no conclusive meaning, we've already heard from Roger Ebert, who's in this interview with Martin Scorsese about Pulp Fiction. And because Roger Ebert was naming his favorite films of the 90s, and Pulp Fiction came up. And Martin Scorsese likes it, but thinks it's a car without an engine or something. He's like, I like the idea of something beautiful, but it doesn't drive anywhere. But I think Martin Scorsese would admit that these days Pulp Fiction looks pretty good after a long amount of time, and he has admitted. Because it's like in his Masterclass, because it's like nowadays those kind of films look more beautiful, because they're seductive and they're nihilistic and they're Freudian, and they're mainstay, and everybody goes to Pulp Fiction if they have nothing else to watch. And me, I always have to go through everybody's room and see what, no, I'm kidding, see what happened to my copy. No, I'm kidding. I don't have to do that. But the thing I'm getting at, we have 10 more minutes, class, so hang in there. The broader scope of the film Pulp Fiction being an auteur film means that his imprint of coolness and his imprint of nihilism, which is the meaninglessness of nothingness, which is nothingness is meaningless, and everything is nothing, and nothing is meaning, and meaning is nothing, and nothing is meaning. And that's nihilism. And then there's this sort of coolness that brings the ethic of coolness. Well, I can deal with this situation no matter how bad it gets and still be looking like a badass. That's kind of the ethic of coolness. And then there's this sort of thing that it's like these gestures or these mimesis of these real characters that are taken from these movies, like in With Thurman's My Life to Live characterization of Anna Karina. And that Anna Karina motif plays throughout. There's this scene in My Life to Live by Godard, and it shows this in the Dana Poland book. And if you go up on Pulp Fiction and you go up on the back of her head, the character on the back of the head is Anna Karina, but she's playing a streetwalker in this film in France. And you go up behind her and you see her mod hair coming down in such a way that now she's very attractive. She looks like Pandora's Box, Claudette Colbert, Pandora's Box, Diary of a Lost Girl, Sid Charisse. That isn't who's in those movies. It's another actress. And I should look it up on my computer. But we've talked about her in film criticism. And Anna Karina puts on this whole display of that sort of Pandora's Box, And I think that we all got to give credit to the pastiche in the film for actually coming out so original, because a parody, why postmodernism has parodies is because that's a remake of the movie done the hilarious, funny way, but it's usually pretty lowbrow. A pastiche is very highbrow. It recontextualizes low and high to make sort of this pop culture thing out of it. And then the pop culture sort of gravitates to this coolness and becomes a high art when it becomes meaningless, and then becomes an ethic here. So the art, you can see the nihilism of the art, just saying, look at the art itself, versus the ethics of the ethics of the coolness, being cool. And that means that you're progressing towards this character that's already yourself. But if you get shaken or stirred or knocked on your ass, then you're still a badass, because you can get back up. Me, if I get knocked on my ass, I'm all crying and sucking my thumb I don't want to get knocked on my ass, but, And one thing that's cool about Pulp Fiction is that, it's really a fiction world. We're thinking it's all real. You can watch that film and say, well, these images that are taken from this script. I remember reading the script, and I remember how the Vega brothers are attached to each other, because there's a brother in Reservoir Dogs that plays a Vega brother, and a brother in Pulp Fiction that plays a Vincent Vega, John Travolta, and those guys are brothers, and that there was this sort of project going on with the Vega brothers, and that they're mentioned in Jackie Brown is totally part of the genius of the world of Tarantino, and that's how a world goes. It's not just tracking shots in Tarantino, but there's kind of these Antonioni pop cult shots of this Art Deco in ways, Hubert Art Deco and the spaceship in 2001, And while the characters are exaggerated, one thing about exaggeration, though, is that doesn't always seem cool. These characters are not always exaggerated. Underplayed, not really curbing their enthusiasm is the way they're cool, because interestingly enough, they're not like me. They don't resolve on the same thing over and over. It's like they're characters in the film, and they're discussing all these modeling pop cult stories. And that throws back to the Madonna story in Reservoir Dogs. And no, it's fine. In Reservoir Dogs, when they're talking about Madonna, and then in Pulp Fiction, when it starts out, and Samuel L. Jackson and John Travolta are in one of those beautiful car scenes. The car's all messed up because, they just came from blowing a dude up. But that's not even it. That scene is out juxtaposed later, not even with that scene. Those scenes of them in the car are all told out of sequence throughout the film. But that's what's so brilliant about it, is that actually that some of them you just have to jump them over each other or blend them back together. That's why I say out of sequence. But that's more out of context because they're put alternately between the takes. Now, it's not a flaw with the film, but the beginning and end has Amanda Plummer say something the same, and that's when you notice, that's when you get your car keys and notice, wait. Oh yeah, they just linked this scene with the beginning. It's not a second time it happened. Or is it? No. It's the first time it happened. It goes with the very first of the scene. So the very last image goes right after the first scene with the credits and everything. And that is, the credits happen separately, but in the second scene of the ending, it's now the hold-up scene where Samuel L. Jackson does give all his money away, but he doesn't get disenfranchised. So if that comes at the beginning, then they've already shot that dude in the head. So that scene with him shot in the head, which is first, goes even before that. And I know we're all confused again. And the confusion gets cooled down. Everything that's blowing up and over the surface and seamy about this neo-noir is kind of mowed over by coolness. And the progression towards kind of a safety net of being cool, but not just a safety net, a warrior that can, and it's not always a dangerous warrior in these worlds. And that we sympathize with the characters all throughout is because some of the characters are in all the stories and some are not. And that's why we sympathize with all of them, because we're seeing the repeat characters meet the ones there. And that's a pretty easy to go movie technique, although writing a script for that with an ensemble cast and still having your main event cast is like not the same, because it's, the whole thing's the main event. You have your main event cast and every part matters. Eric Stoltz's part, I'm hanging up the phone, prank caller. I even got a prank call, as I tell you, that it was from someone. And they said, I'm hanging up the phone, prank caller to me. And I thought, but you're the prank caller? Okay. But I wasn't doing anything else that Eric Stoltz was on the phone, I promise. And to even mention that totally condemns me. And to totally say you've acted like one of the characters in Pulp Fiction used to be jail time for people, I swear. And the movie was so hard-hitting when it came out, nobody could believe it. And the presidents of the United States were thinking, oh, that's scary. That's the scariest movie. And I was like, one time I watched it when I was smoking weed, and I thought it was real. I thought John Travolta was going to come out of my TV. And I had my copy of Dianetics sitting there, and I'm like, oh, dude, the only way I can get over this paranoia is by reading another chapter. And I'm like, I wasn't joking, but I was laughing because I was stoned. And I was like, but the world of the film kind of popped out visually like it could really be happening, refilmed in my neighborhood like a live-action fly scene, which I wouldn't put that past some of the tricks you get played on as a film critic or as a director. But I'm pretty small potatoes, so I'm pretty sure they weren't putting on a live version of it because, well, it's the old saying, John Travolta's still alive. He dies in Pulp Fiction in the middle, which means that all the other scenes with him, which is most of the rest of the movie, comes before that. But when Bruce Willis kills him, it's because these Pop-Tarts pop up, or this toast that he's got in the toaster, and John Travolta walks out with his Truffaut book. He's got his Truffaut book whenever he's using the bathroom. His pants are down. He's reading like Noir. He's reading a Pulp Fiction type book. And he's a really interesting character. And there's this whole thing at the beginning where there's this divine intervention thing where this guy comes running around a corner and shoots at Samuel Jackson and John Travolta, and they shoot everybody down in the room, including him, and get their briefcase back. And I'm like, they had already gotten it back, but they're leaving. This guy comes busting around the corner. And that's told out of sequence too. The Marvin situation. That's the other subtitle. And when he shoots at him and he misses, and there's all these like stacked up shots, and the edit shows those two guys standing there and they get missed by the bullets. That has happened in real life, but those guys can't believe it because he had the gun almost right next to him. And so that he misses them, John Travolta thinks it's an act of God. Not necessarily to believe in God, but an act of God. Like, that could never happen. That's divinity intervening. And Samuel L. Jackson's like, well, I don't think it was divine intervention. I think it was an accident that we barely escaped. But I got to switch around because it was actually Samuel L. Jackson that then takes the point that it's divine intervention in the film. So it's not John Travolta. Sorry, that was a flaw. A- for me today. But Samuel L. Jackson is actually the one that they both kind of are wondering, do you really think that God stopped those bullets, man? And so now we've got this like not believe in God from John Travolta. Sorry, I said he was the one. That was a flaw of mine. And then we got Samuel L. Jackson saying, yes, but that could have been divine intervention. Now notice in that scene that why I'm confused is because they both kind of change sides on the argument all throughout the movie. Now I'm not justifying my lack of my error, because it's there. But they do, in fact, kind of argue one way or the other whether there's a real God. And you can tell they're joking about it, even at the end, because they're basically saying Marcellus Wallace is God. Because his briefcase, the MacGuffin, is the one that has the spirit in it. The spirit of man or whatever. And that just means we don't ever find out what's in it. We don't ever find out what's in the briefcase. It's a shining light that shines on him, like out of the trunk shot, like at the beginning of the film. From down here up, you shoot a camera, it looks like they're coming right over you. And so I conclude today with no problems I hope that you're having this semester. Class 4 is coming either later this week or next week. We'll see. I can't give you the exact day or time because we tried to stick with it yesterday and we had a few technical difficulties. We're fine. I'll get another copy of Pulp Fiction, lickety split somehow. I'll tell the Library of Congress to send me one. But the Library of Congress did already induct this film, and this film did win Academy Awards. And we're going to talk about it a little bit more next week, but we've kind of looked at it from the angles I wanted to. There's more to discuss, though, next week. So sorry to kind of end my speech abruptly and have some loose ends in it, but the main thing is the quality of the film shown relies on the distinction of the characteristics of the production value of the film. And we'll talk next time.